To my sorrow, the powers that be have scheduled one section of AP Seminar for the same period as AP Art History, so once again I will be addressing you as the disembodied voice. In art history, you practiced answering a question with a clear, direct answer, a thesis, and defending that thesis with specific visual and contextual evidence. In AP Seminar, you will dig deeper into argumentation, looking not only at claims and evidence, but also at competing claims and competing evidence. Your first homework assignment introduced two compelling, but also contradictory views about the value of music and the role it plays in society. So let's start with Plato. What is his thesis? What is his main idea about music? Mr. Hauser will silence me while you talk this over. You know I love cartoons, right? In this cartoon, Socrates seems to be protesting that the wrong kind of music interferes with rational thought, virtuous living, and good government. Alan Bloom would add it makes young people think too much about sex. I suspect you found some of Socrates' musical distinctions confusing, and it doesn't help that we aren't entirely sure what these various modes even sounded like. But whatever the approved modes really were, Plato thought, or claimed to think, that government should dictate the score playing in our personal lives and in society as a whole. What about Nietzsche? What is his thesis? Let's pause again. I love this cartoon series, as does Mr. Hauser. Socrates or Plato thought that some kinds of music could intoxicate the senses and drive out rational thought. Nietzsche agreed, and that's just why he liked it. Stop thinking so much, just feel. And no, Kelly Clarkson did not say this first. According to Nietzsche, music unleashes the drive to experience power and even to inflict one's power on others. It's a little unfair to Nietzsche to say this, but many years later, Hitler was a big fan. But this, I would note, is not the model of argumentation we're striving for. Okay, enough cartoons. Time to go into boring details about what the ECB wants you to achieve this year and how you can get there. We've talked in only rather general terms about the rather unusual AP class and what it's going to require. Some of the details are laid out in your syllabus and all will be revealed in time. For now, you should know that 45% of your final AP score will be determined by a 2-hour essay exam with 2 questions. The first question will ask you to read a short article that you've never seen and to analyze the argument that the author makes. You will answer this question in 3 parts on 3 separately labeled pages. The first question asks you to identify the thesis or main point of the article. That thesis statement should include the major claims, much as the thesis statement of an AP World History essay includes the major points you intend to make, and offers, as a result, a roadmap of the article. The second question asks you to explain the line of reasoning in the article, not only what the claims are, but how they build logically to support the thesis, and how these claims are in turn supported by evidence. The third question, rather confusingly, and neither Mr. Hauser nor I really likes this organization, but the third question asks you to evaluate the evidence. Is the evidence relevant to the claim? Does it really support the line of reasoning? Is the source credible? Again, we find this organization confusing, but don't panic. We're going to practice this format a lot. In fact, we're going to start practicing it today, at least the first part of the question, looking at how we identify a main idea or a thesis. But first, just to finish up my introduction to the AP essay exam, this is the second and in terms of your score more important essay. It's called a synthesis essay, since you are incorporating sources as evidence. But, as you'll see, it's really another argumentative essay. The difference is that this time you make the argument, you establish a thesis, but incorporate evidence from at least 2 of the 4 sources that the ECB will throw at you. Mr. Hauser, in my opinion, does an amazing job of teaching students how to write the synthesis essay. By the way, you will also have to write a synthesis essay on your AP Language and Composition exam junior year, and students who've taken AP Seminar usually rock this question and come tell Mr. Hauser how much they love him, as they should. Note that the first essay is entirely analytical. It's all about what somebody else said. The second essay allows you, and really it requires you, to interject your own opinion and to add what we're going to call your personal voice. So keep thinking about your own reaction to the arguments you encounter in this unit. How do you mark the music in your life? Does it ever lead you into bad places? Into good places? Should someone else tell you what you can listen to? Should you tell yourself not to listen to some music? How does music matter in your life? You'll be exploring these questions in your presentation. But for now, let's just focus on what it means to make an argument and the critical components of an argument. And for this, we will turn first to those noted experts, the men of Monty Python's Flying Circus. Well, I hope you can all tell the difference between argument and abuse, which would put you ahead of a lot of politicians these days. Our focus is, of course, argument. So let's get back to your first AP exam essay, the argument analysis essay, and define some terms. The first section of the first of your 2 AP seminar essay questions will always ask you to find the author's argument, main idea, or thesis. Note that the College Board uses all 3 terms interchangeably. The 2 long AP World History essays, the document-based question and the long essay question, also require you to include a thesis, or more precisely, an analytical thesis. So now you're going to get into groups and spend a few minutes trying to identify the thesis or main idea of the article you read for homework, the edited chapter on dangerous music from Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind. Welcome back. While Mr. Hauser compiles your entries and gets ready to declare winners, I'm going to talk more about thesis statements. And I'm going to begin with a confession. I think that the thesis statement is something of an imaginary animal made up by teachers to confound students. Serious journalistic or scholarly articles, and even more, books, almost never have a one-sentence thesis that sums up a single central point that the author is trying to make. There's a reason it was hard to identify Alan Bloom's thesis. He made a number of important and, yes, related points. I think it's tough to fit them under one umbrella statement. But, and this is nothing new, the ECP doesn't really agree with me. Many of your AP exams will demand that you either identify or create a strong thesis. So today, we will start learning how to craft a yellow-beaked, pointed-eared porcupine. I hereby dub this animal the thesis monster. Just call me Mrs. Frankenstein. I played around on Google for a definition of a thesis statement, and I found one I kind of liked, though I rewrote it a little. So what is this really saying? First, a thesis is an interpretation, not a subject. Suppose you get a question on the history exam that asks you to discuss the shared characteristics of early civilizations. I am writing about the shared characteristics of early civilizations is not a thesis. It is the subject of the essay or a restatement of the question. Your thesis should be that civilizations share certain features, and your thesis should also briefly outline these features and therefore signal how you will be organizing your argument into claims. A thesis, therefore, almost always makes direct or indirect reference to the claims or line of reasoning that you will present in your essay or that the author presented in an essay. Think of it as a trailer for the essay. A thesis does not make an obvious or uninteresting statement that no one would disagree with or feel like examining further. Say, early civilizations shaped history. Finally, it's often a good idea to try to put your thesis into a single sentence. The problem with writing a multiple sentence thesis is that you often end up listing claims but not explaining how or why they fit together. That point will be clear when we take a look at the thesis statements that our very first season of AP Seminar turned in on the Alan Bloom chapter. This was actually Season 1's winning entry. And since I haven't seen your contest entries, I don't know if this year's class did better or worse. What's really good about this thesis statement, and it's absolutely necessary to get full points on this part of the argument analysis essay, is that it includes 2 central but interconnected ideas. The problem of rock music and the problem of education, or I should say really, the problem of rock music and its solution in education and self-regulation. Now, I'm going to take the winning entry apart. What problems do you see with this thesis? Well, for starters, what's wrong with the first sentence? It includes one of the most common grammatical errors, a comma splice. Two independent clauses, that is, clauses that could stand on their own as sentences with the subject and verb, must be joined by a comma and a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon, not just a comma. Affect people doesn't say how music affects, and with their emotions and passions is really imprecise. How about what might be a better way to say affect with emotions and passions? What would be a stronger way to state that? How about ignites passions, stirs? Mr. Hauser calls these power verbs. Also note that our winners presented two separate though related ideas. Can they be more clearly tied together? That is, combined into a single thesis that unites the problem with a solution? And finally, who is we? Watch out for general and imprecise pronouns. Here you see how I rewrote the same idea into what I think is a more analytical thesis. Note that instead of joining two separate ideas into two separate sentences loosely tied together with a therefore, I used a subordinate or dependent clause beginning with because. That's what you've probably heard described as a complex sentence. You don't always have to write your thesis statement as a complex sentence, but in my experience, the best thesis statements often take this form. By including a subordinate clause, you automatically create a logical connection between your main points. Again, in this case, a problem and a solution. This, in other words, imposes some discipline on our thesis monster. Also note the verbs I chose. I hope these pass muster with Mr. Hauser as power verbs. As you work on writing this year, and you're going to work a lot on your writing this year, I want you to pay close attention to what English teachers call diction. That is, choice of the very best words. Good word choice begins with power verbs and strong, precise nouns. Comparing these two versions of the same thesis may make what I just said a little clearer. The top sentence is the one you saw, again, written in what we call a complex sentence form. Note that instead of joining two separate ideas with a coordinating conjunction, I use a subordinate or dependent clause to show that the solution, self-regulation, follows logically from the problem, dangerous music. The bottom sentence is a compound sentence. It connects two complete sentences, two complete subject-verb combinations into a single sentence. And really, it says the same thing. But the connection between the ideas and the two parts of the sentence is weaker. By the way, in my experience, students love to write long compound sentences, since long sentences seem like what smart people write. They shy away from simple sentences and from complex sentences, but in fact, varied sentence structure is one of the signs of good writing. So now let's look at some non-winning thesis entries. What's wrong with this thesis? The tree imagery may give you a clue. Really, this is three claims, not a thesis that ties those claims together. But, and I think it was back in season 3, a fellow teacher suggested a different metaphor, and we all decided we liked it better. This is a Frankenstein monster thesis. Ideas that don't have a clear relationship to each other and are barely stitched together. I have another concern with this thesis statement. Does Bloom talk about violence and drugs? You'd think he would. Sex, violence, and rock and roll seems to go together in the minds of crazed adults, right? But in truth, he really only talks about sex and the way what he sees as a highly sexed, he uses the delicious word orgiastic, music undermines reason. And finally, what important ideas in the thesis are missing from this thesis? Well, there's a statement, but there is no hint of the role education and self-control play in creating a solution. Very, very often, the essays you will evaluate for an argument analysis essay present a problem and a solution or a cause and effect. If your thesis statement doesn't mention both, if your thesis statement doesn't connect them in some way, you will not get points. So why do you think I'm showing you half a tree here? This thesis begs, that is, it fails to answer two very important questions. What are they? What is the negative effect of rock and roll music? And who should monitor the music? Teachers? Parents? The FBI? The NSA? Young people themselves? Also, what issue that is central to Bloom's argument does this leave out? It doesn't talk at all about education. That term monitoring, it's very vague. This is too narrow a thesis and it isn't analytical enough, which means basically it doesn't have enough content. Do you remember our mantra from back in AP Art History? Write more. To my mind, this thin and uninformative thesis raises several important questions. Does Bloom really believe that either rock and roll or its consequences is inevitable? If that's what he thinks, why did he bother to write the book? Does rock and roll meet the needs of culture, or is it transforming or destroying culture? What cultural need is rock and roll meeting? Is need the right word? Where is education or self-monitoring in this thesis statement? What kind of claims from the article would support this thesis? The thesis suggests an argument built around a discussion of changing cultural imperatives or needs, but Bloom is actually deliberately countercultural. He thinks that the culture is changing in bad ways. And finally, this thesis, again, simply isn't meaty enough. There are no claims. Put a few ornaments on the tree, and it can't take the weight. Okay, sorry, this one doesn't even have ornaments weighing it down. First, what's wrong with this sentence? It's not a sentence. Your thesis will always be at least one complete sentence. Besides having more words, an analytical thesis needs some specific. There is no roadmap. Here be dragons. Actually, I really like the first of these. It makes an interesting claim. So why wasn't it a winner? If you think about it, Bloom doesn't really praise classical music. He thinks smart students listen to it mostly because it was expected of them back in the day. Personally, I think Stanley Kubrick in Clockwork Orange comes closer to being right about Beethoven than Bloom. Beethoven composed audio tracks for extreme actions and emotions. And if you're going to talk about intense rhythms, well, what was it about those rhythms that really bothered Bloom? It's the sexual suggestiveness of these rhythms, right? A thesis is no place to be coy. Moving to the next thesis, does rock music cause an impulse to sex? Bloom may think so, but he doesn't stop there. And what is barbaric? It's a good word, but it needs some explanation. We're talking about letting physical impulses and not mental reasoning control life. Music is changing the American mind is actually a good start, although I'd say which Americans, but it really needs several phrases introduced with a by. By, for example, encouraging students to follow the impulses of their bodies, not the reasoning of their minds. How music influences the soul is also not a sentence, and it's also not an interpretation. It's a statement of the subject of the book chapter. And for the last one, let me just offer some very basic advice. Be very careful about using the word unique. Very little in this world is truly unique. And I would argue that music affects people in quite similar ways. Okay, enough. I think you almost certainly get that a thesis should be a big idea that can be supported by at least 3 claims, and it should have some serious verbal meat on its bones. It should signal where your essay is going. In an essay, you will support your thesis with claims. And by the way, 3 is not a magic number, but it's very often the right number for an AP length essay. So each paragraph should consist of a claim, basically the topic sentence of the paragraph, and that claim should include plenty of evidence to support it, or should be accompanied by plenty of evidence to support it. Furthermore, you want to show that the source of the evidence is reliable. A Harvard professor, for example, is more reliable than your little brother. And the evidence has to actually support what you're claiming. As you'll discover throughout the year, that's actually harder than it sounds. To continue with our model of a good argument, and a good argument doesn't hide from the strongest case that the other side can make. It takes on the other side, addresses that argument, beats it to a pulp. That is a rebuttal. Did Bloom do this? What do you think? It's worth considering in a minute. And finally, a thesis and supporting claims are strongest when they are qualified, when the writer acknowledges that there may be some limits to the thesis, or some cases in which it doesn't apply, or, and AP World History graders would love this, some claims that still need more evidence. How would you again evaluate Bloom on this score? I don't know if you'll have time for this, but to put it more bluntly, what kind of grade would you give Professor Bloom if you were analyzing his argument? For the next day's homework, you're going to practice identifying the thesis of 3 relatively short excerpts about music, one of which I stole from Mr. Hauser's master's thesis. For the day after that, you're going to hear from 2 music critics, one of them a close friend of Alan Bloom, who nevertheless thinks that he's clueless when it comes to music.